Suspension mountain bikes rely on a well-operating rear shock and of course all of those pivots to be smooth and operating well in order for the back end to track properly and do its job. Now, due to the way mountain bikes are ridden in a variety of conditions, from time to time you're going to need to replace these bearings or at the very least give them a good service. Now, if you fancy having a go at that at home, it's not really a hard job to do, but it can involve some specialist tools. So this is what you're going to need and this is how you do it. Now, before we get started, it's just important to remind you that all mountain bike frames are different. It's very unlikely that the one that I'm going to show you here is going to have the same bearings as your frame. Now, some bikes have the bearings as part of the rear end of the frame. Some of them, they're included as part of the main frame. Some of those bearings are going to be located in the swing links or the rockers on the bike. And of course, they're all going to use slightly different methods of getting the bearings pressed in there and also for extracting the bearing. For example, if you've got a massive lower pivot bearing, your main pivot of the bike, if those bearings are housed on the main frame, it's quite likely they're going to be similar bearings to what you'd have in hubs, so quite a big bearing, or even bottom brackets, like a huge bearing. If that's the case, you're going to need something like a bottom bracket bearing installation device, or the same for a hub. In my case, I'm using a Nukeproof, and on that particular bike, the bearings are quite small and they're all based on the back end of the bike, so I'm going to need quite a compact bearing extractor and also putting the bearings back in again. Now, this is just a guide just to demonstrate the technique to you and the things you need to bear in mind when doing this yourself. It is going to vary very slightly for each manufacturer. If you're unsure about this, double check on your manufacturer's website. There should be a service manual with your bike, or at least available online, and it will have an exploded diagram showing you the order that those bearings and washers go into the back end of the bike. As always, if you're unsure about this sort of thing, consult your mechanic at your local bike shop first. So the tools you're going to need are going to vary depending on the type of bike you got and the type of bearings that are in there. Now, we can only recommend that you use the correct tools, but there are obviously a few different methods you can have. The safest way is using a dedicated bearing press and extraction tool. So there's various different ones on the market to suit different types of bearing at different parts of the bike. Now, of course, I'm aware that they're expensive, so there are other options for this sort of thing that I'm sure all of you are going to look at. Now, you could use a simple punch and a mallet. That's definitely going to do the job of getting the bearing out of the bike, but it's going to be very easy to damage that bearing. And if you do so, you're obviously not going to be able to use that. But more importantly, you don't want to be damaging the frame when you're taking it out. So if you use that technique, you're pretty much on your own. Be careful, it's possible, of course, but just take your time if you're going to do that. And again, for putting the bearings back in, you could use a block of wood and a mallet. I've done that in the past successfully on some designs. But obviously, you've got to use your common sense. You can't just do this on any part of the bike. You can only do it in certain parts of the frame that are safe to do that. Again, I can't recommend you do that. I always recommend using the correct tool for the job. But if you insist on doing a homemade method, you could make something similar to this fairly easily at home. So get yourself some threaded bar, some quality nuts, and then get yourself a selection of different washers that match up the size of your bearings on the bike. That's going to be the safest way without having the correct tool of getting your bearings back into the bike again. So I'll show you how to make one of those in another video, but for this video, I want to show you the correct way of doing it, the safest way and the best way. So for this particular job, I'm doing it on my Nukeproof Mega 290. It doesn't actually need a bearing change, but obviously if we kept waiting for things to wear themselves out on our bikes, you'd be waiting a long time for these videos. So I'm going to be taking out my perfectly good bearings and reinstalling some more perfectly good bearings, just for your benefit. In order to do that, I've obviously got a bearing kit dedicated for my bike. I've got a compact bearing installation tool. I've got thread lock, I've got grease, rubber mallet. Got my little tin with my ferrules and cable end caps and nipples in there. I've also got a chain master link because I need to take my chain off and my rear mech off the bike, and I like to make sure my chain has the least likelihood of snapping when I put it back together, so I'm going to put a fresh link on there. And of course, the crucial Allen keys, in my case 4, 5 and a 6. Okay, so first things first is the preparation before you get started taking those bearings out. Now, obviously, bike and the work stand here. If you haven't got a work stand, put your bike upside down on the floor, take the wheels off. Then you need to start taking the components out. So in this case, my bike's in the work stand, wheels are off. Need to take the rear brake off, need to take the chain off, need to take the rear mech off, the shock off. And in this case, I need to take the cranks off because I've got a chain guide that's obscuring the lower pivot bolt here. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a bike that's got internal cable routing and look really nice, then this process is actually a bit harder for you. As you see on my bike here, the rear brake caliper's got external routing, so I can simply snip the cable ties here and the caliper can dangle neatly, so I don't have to re-bleed that afterwards. If you've got internal routing, when you do that, you're going to have to re-bleed your brake because you'll probably have to take the caliper off to get the hose out of the swing arm in order to take the swing arm off the bike. If that's the case and you've got Shimano or SRAM brakes, there's bleeding videos in the description below so you can follow that process once you've done this. Same applies for the rear mech of the bike or the rear derailleur. You're going to need to cut your inner cable here in order to take the rear mech off. In my case, I've got an external hose that runs all the way to the shifter, and I've got 2 cable ties here, so I can cut those and take the rear mech off and let that dangle. I do, however, need to split my chain, which means I'm going to have to use a fresh link in it when I do that. And of course, I need to take my cranks off and the shock off. Now what we're left with is the back end of the bike. Now this still feels really, really smooth. You can get your bike to this stage even just by taking the rear shock out and cycling your rear suspension up and down. You're going to be able to identify if your bearings are knackered pretty easily. Again, there's no noise here. As you can see, it's really free in movement, so that suggests they're in good condition. But we're going to go ahead and pull all of these pivots out now, get the back end off and start showing you how to remove those bearings and inspect them. So back end is off, I've got everything laid out on the workbench here. Now I still need to separate the chain stays from the seat stays, but before I do that, just before I go any further, I'm just going to give this a quick wipe down and then we're going to start inspecting things and seeing what sort of condition the bearings are in. So personally, I don't like to get too hands on with this sort of stuff. I'm just going to give it a bit of a wipe over with a rag and some solvent on there. I'm going to try and avoid going too near the bearings with this sort of stuff. I'm not looking to completely clean this, just get the worst off. It's a good time as well, whenever you're doing this sort of thing, just to inspect your bike to see if there's any paint missing or unusual markings or even cracks. You know, if you haven't done this for some time, they do happen. Bikes aren't invincible, and it could just be a hairline crack, but nonetheless, it can still grow. So I've carefully taken the whole back end of the Nukeproof apart now. So I'm left with the chain stay, the seat stay, and the swing link, as well as all of the gubbins. Now, this is the point when you can decide if you're actually going to replace your bearings or if you're going to do a bit of a ghetto fix on them. Now, bear in mind, by replacing the bearings, they're obviously going to last longer. But if your bearings are just a bit dry, for example, and they're still working okay, you can do the ghetto hack that I showed you recently, where you pick off very delicately the rubber seals on both sides, force out all of the sort of gunk that's in there with a degreaser, and then grease them and put the caps back on. That was in my headset video. Now, it's a really good thing to do on a suspension bike because those sort of things do sort of need regular attention, especially in the sort of conditions that I ride in. But bear in mind, it's never going to last as long as changing the bearings outright. And something else to factor in is if you're changing a bearing or two, you may as well do the whole lot so they wear evenly. If you've got some bearings that are absolutely knackered, of course, recycle those, get rid of them. But the bearings that you think have still got some life in them, I'd recommend doing that ghetto fix on them and keeping them as spares because they will come in handy at some point. So just work your way around. You can feel the bearings manually. That one's smooth actually, that's not too bad. No reason for actually changing that. Again, I'm going to emphasize this by taking them out just to show you this. But you can work your way around. You can make those decisions yourself on the bearings on the bike that you're actually going to change. Some of the bearings get a lot more use than others. Some are smaller, some are bigger, some are more susceptible to sort of lateral play and twisting. And other ones seem to never get anywhere at all. These are the main ones, the main pivot. And actually, that was a little bit rough, but just dry, I suspect. It's nothing major. We have a lot of wet weather here, so it's a good chance that all that stuff has just been washed out. So next step is to start removing these bearings using the bearing extraction tool. Again, this is something you can do yourself with a punch and a mallet or an improvised tool, but there's a high chance you're going to damage the bearings and the frame when you do this. So if you do that, take care. And of course, if you do that, you are on your own. So just take that into account. So now the back end completely off the bike, I've decided I'm going to remove all of the bearings and start fresh, put some new bearings back in. So that means I'm going to need to get the bearings out of the bike. and it means working in some small confined spaces like this. So to do that, I've chosen to use this little compact setup. So it's not quite the offering like you would get from someone like Enduro that do the full-size mechanical ones for workshops. This is more like for the advanced home mechanic. I think they're still quite reasonably priced. They're priced for a kit with 2 lengths of bar. So in this case, I could use the bar in this quite narrow space here quite easily. And then you choose the male and female adapters for extraction and pressing back in again according to the bearings on your bike. Now on the website you choose these by just looking at the number that's on the seal of your bearings, and that correlates to the particular male and female parts that you need. So in this case for these bearings I'm going to demonstrate on the main pivot bearings that are down by the bottom bracket here. So for this particular tool, the red bits are for extracting the bearings and the blue bits are for installing the bearings afterwards. So for this particular bearing, you need to put the extraction tool, slide that into place, slide the shorter piece in there, just nip that up, and put the larger piece that sits up against the frame. Now, I just need to carefully just tighten this against each other. As you can see, this piece is pushing the bearing out and into the larger section. There we go, and that is the first bearing out. And there we go, first bearing removed from the frame. Now of course you need to just inspect the frame, make sure it's not damaged in any way, give it a bit of a clean, wipe it out, make sure there's no sort of stress, damage, cracks or anything like that. And if you're intending on reusing these bearings for spares later, you can do that Ghetto fix, which I showed you in the headset video. The link to that is in the description below. And in that video, I demonstrate how to remove the rubber seal from both sides of the bearing, flush the bearing out and put fresh grease back in there, and then it will continue working quite happily. But in this case, I'm removing all of these bearings and then we're going to put some fresh ones straight back in. Now next up we're going to look at is the swing link of the bike. So it just has a single bearing on each side. I've taken one of these out a second ago. I'm just going to demonstrate the other one to you. This is where this compact tool comes in handy because it's a very awkward little space to work in that you would probably struggle with a lot of other tools. As you can see by looking on the inside here, you see the lip where the bearing sits in place. And this is one of those lipped bearings, like so, which means it can't be pushed out to the inside, it has to be pushed from the inside out. So important to take that into account before you damage anything. So removal side of the tool pushes into place, slide in the small side of the tool, which just about fits in there neatly. I think you'll find this fits most suspension bikes quite well. And then this one was the number 11. Slide that on there. A larger piece of the tool onto here. Large part of the tool on the back side there. And then give it a good couple of turns. I can see it just moving. Any second now, it's just gonna pop out. Boop, there we go. And that is the bearing successfully out of this swing link of the bike. So there we go. There is my back end of the bike, minus all of the bearings. Time for the new bearings to go back in. Of course, first things first, give it all a good clean, make sure those bearing surfaces are clean. And then one by one, you want to start pushing the bearings back in, using the right parts of the tool, and just taking a bit of care to do so. So that is all of the bearings out the back end of the bike. Frame has been cleaned, it's ready now to have all of these nice new shiny bearings pushed into the frame. Of course, I just want to do it one by one, taking my time and put a little bit of grease on each one. So let's go. First up, I'm just going to do the swing link here. Just a small amount of grease on the inside here, just to make sure it slides in properly. Now, this is the side the bearing needs to be pushed in from. This is the part of the bearing tool that slides it back in place. You've got the backing plate that pushes up against there. Just slide this into here. When you're pushing your bearings into the frame is to check at all times that everything is aligned properly. Because you do not want to damage your frame in trying to push a bearing in that's not straight and is never going to be sent home correctly. Now this one is already going in nice and neatly, and we're home. Remove the tool, and that is the first bearing successfully pushed back into the frame, and it feels great. So I'm going to repeat that process with all the other bearings on the bike, just taking my time to make sure everything is back in. Again, think of the old proverb, measure twice, cut once. It's important with this sort of thing. You do not want to rush it. So there we go, that is all of the bearings into the back of the frame, ready to reassemble. Now something that's absolutely crucial when you're reassembling it, of course, is making sure the correct bolts and pins and washers go in place just as when you strip the bike down, but make sure that you use some thread lock when you're reassembling them. Okay, so just a bit of thread lock on each one of the bolts. Carefully slide those back into place on the back end of the bike, making sure that any washers that were previously in there also go back in, and make sure it just lines up, and then it goes. When the rear triangle is fully reassembled and I bolt it onto the back of the bike, I'm then going to go around with a torque wrench and just double check all of these to manufacture settings. With something like these, I highly recommend doing that because you don't want them to come loose, you don't want to over tighten them either, because that can damage things. So there we go, the back end of the bike is on. I've just got to work my way around now and just make sure the last few bolts are in place, put the shock back in there, and then of course, brakes and gears back on there. Now, if you're unlucky enough to have internal cable routing on your bike, you're probably going to need to bleed your rear brake when you put it back together. So if you want to find out how to do that, click down here for how to bleed a SRAM brake. There's a Shimano brake link in the description below as well. And if you need to do your gears on the way back in, click up here if you want to find out how everything to do with tuning your rear derailleur, putting a fresh cable in there. As always, please click on the globe to subscribe because we've got brand new content coming for you every single week on GMBN Tech. And if you like the video or you found it helpful, give us a thumbs up.